This video is sponsored by Surfshark. After 4 races in 2020 at the height of Mercedes' dominance, they had 146 points in the Constructors' Championship. In 2021, that fell slightly to 141. In 2022, that number almost halved to 77. In 2023, it was just a point less at 76. And now in 2024, they have just 34 points, which, to put that into historical context, makes 2024 Mercedes' worst start to a season since 2011, which was only their second season in Formula 1. In every single sport, eras of domination, whether it's a team or an individual, always come to an end, and Formula 1 is no different. The reason I bring this point up is because, just as on my channel now I try to give Max Verstappen and every person at Red Bull their flowers for the level of excellence we see season after season, it's also important to remember that what Mercedes with Lewis achieved over such a long time is still unprecedented in terms of the records that they broke, the records that they set, and the mark that they made on Formula 1 history. Having said that, even though they've now reached a new level of uncompetitiveness, the factors that have either directly led or influenced their downfall started to become apparent even as early as 2020. On an operational level, Mercedes have made mistakes on strategy and been mediocre in pit stops for many years now. But whilst in 2020 their car advantage and Lewis Hamilton were able to mask these mistakes, once they were in a head-to-head title battle with Red Bull in 2021, and then especially once they were closer to the midfield and under even more scrutiny from 2022 onwards, their operational shortcomings have been completely exposed. Now, to clarify, throughout this video when I talk about Mercedes, I'm always going to compare them to Red Bull. Yes, whilst Mercedes compare favourably to the likes of Haas and Sauber on an operational level, if you want to be the best in Formula 1, you've got to beat the best. And right now Red Bull is the absolute benchmark in almost every department. Since 2015, DHL has tracked all of the fastest pit stops across every single race to create a championship-style ranking that definitively shows how all of the teams compare. 2017 was the last season that Mercedes topped that list for having the fastest pit stops, and since then, this has been their ranking. Whilst they were challenging for championships, they remained relatively competitive, although never best in class. However, since 2022, they have comfortably been one of the worst. And it's clear that the pressure that's come about from the car's poor performance has now also put pressure and exposed the operational side of the team as well. And now, if you're wondering exactly how much better Red Bull are compared to Mercedes, well, this is the answer. Since 2018, Red Bull have been ranked as the best team every single season and also are currently leading the 2024 standings as well. Bad pit stops are the most obvious visual example of how a team's incompetence can either lose their drivers vital race time or, in some cases, throw away a result altogether. Whilst we can always point to the memorable disasters like Sakir 2020 when they fitted Bottas's tyres on Russell's car, or Monaco 2021 where they cross-threaded a wheel nut, forcing Valtteri to retire, I actually think in the long run, the consistently slower 3+ second pit stops that we don't see as much of on TV actually hurts their drivers more. Like in Austin last year, where on their strongest track and at their best chance to win a Grand Prix all year, they couldn't deliver Lewis a single sub-3 second pit stop in the fight against Max and Red Bull. Whilst Mercedes have continued to let their drivers down with bad pit stops, the one thing that the team is also lacking is the technical brilliance from the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark VPN. Surfshark is super handy when it comes to getting around watching content that is geo-blocked in your country, like you might have experienced on YouTube or Twitter, or just stuff that's only available to watch in other countries at the time. So for example, recently I wanted to rewatch the amazing Senna documentary, however unfortunately it wasn't available on Netflix in the UK. No problem however, because with the help of this site I found out that it was available in Denmark, and from there it was just a couple of clicks using Surfshark's Google extension to transport me and my virtual location to the home of Kevin Magnuson, and then I just had to refresh Netflix, and that's it. The full movie in full HD, or any movie or TV show that you can think of, ready to go from anywhere in the world. All you need is one Surfshark account, as it can be used on an unlimited number of devices, and so by using my promo code ALDAS, which can be found via the link in the description, or by scanning my unique QR code on the screen, you can get a huge discount on Surfshark and get an extra 3 months for free as well. And on top of that, Surfshark also has a 30-day money-back guarantee if you decide to change your mind. It's a great deal, so make sure to check it out, and thank you again to Surfshark. In 2021, we saw the introduction of the cost cap, which for its first season was set at $145 million for every single team, albeit with lots of exclusions for things like driver salaries, marketing, and any non-F1 or road car related activities, amongst other things. Now, to give you an idea of what the big teams in Formula 1 were spending in the pre-pandemic season in 2019, Mercedes' total budget, which granted also included the development and manufacturing of the engines for their customer teams as well, was $442 million. And now, it's very important to note that all of the top 3 teams at the time, Mercedes, Ferrari and Red Bull, were all spending well over $300 million, and in the case of Ferrari, because of their historical payments and all of the other bonuses that they get, they actually earned more money during these seasons for finishing second than Mercedes ever did for finishing first. The newly formed cost cap had multiple major effects on Mercedes. The first, as with all of the big teams, was that a huge amount of their staff and engineers were either let go, sent to other teams who were scaling up as the bigger teams needed to scale down, like in the case of Ferrari sending people to Haas, or they were redirected to work on other projects within Mercedes that didn't fall under the F1 banner. The next big repercussion was that when Mercedes did start developing their 2022 car during 2021, due to the cost cap and era restrictions, they only had enough money to develop and manufacture one specific concept. In the past, teams like Mercedes would actually allocate money, resources, and lots of engineers to chase multiple concepts and pathways of development. For example, during preseason testing in 2019, for week 2, Mercedes brought out a totally different car to the one that they ran during week 1, with a new front wing, new nose, new side pods, and most importantly for that generation of car, a completely brand new barge board design, which now is like bringing a brand new floor design. Although visually it might not seem like it, as a package it was actually a much more significant change than even what we saw when Mercedes unveiled the Zero side pod design in Bahrain in 2022. Even though Mercedes researched multiple concepts, with the implementation of the budget cap and era restrictions, they didn't have the ability to fully test and commit to those other pathways. But why they landed and committed to the wrong concept in the first place is something we'll get to a little bit later on. Another consequence of the cost cap for Mercedes was that, compared to when they were previously in a fierce development battle with Ferrari over the course of multiple seasons during 2017, 18 and 19, and now there is much less opportunity for in-season development and big architectural changes. The simple fact is that all of the teams on the grid bring less upgrades now than they used to, which means that if you do have any fundamental problems with your concept, you can't change it mid-season. All you can do is keep developing your current car with incremental upgrades to stay competitive, and if you do want to make big architecture changes to your chassis or suspension, you have to wait until next season. The only reason McLaren were able to make the significant improvement that they did in 2023 is because firstly, their real car was delayed, which they admitted at launch, and they were also way more uncompetitive before their Austria upgrade, being down in 6th in the Constructors, having scored just 17 points in the first 8 races. Performance gains in Formula 1 are not linear, they're logarithmic, because it's much harder to improve the closer to the front you get, And that is why McLaren's 23 isn't really comparable to what the likes of Ferrari and Mercedes were hoping to do in 22 and 23, as they were already much closer to Red Bull. The last ramification of the cost gap was a big one, and it is something that is still affecting Mercedes to this day. It gave the teams behind them a more even playing field financially, and gave them a bigger opportunity to close the gap to the already established top teams. And the result of that now is that the likes of Aston Martin and McLaren are not only much closer to them, they have now overtook Mercedes. In the case of Aston Martin, going back just 5 years to 2019, when I said earlier in the video that Mercedes was operating on a budget of $442 million, Racing Point, the team that is now Aston Martin and was only in its first full season under Lawrence Stroll's ownership, was operating on a budget of just $155 million. In 5 years, that same small, overachieving midfield team, with the help of the cost cap which has helped them to invest and scale up as Aston Martin has done so, whilst Mercedes have had to scale down, is now genuinely more competitive than Mercedes. Even though Mercedes are currently ahead of Aston Martin in the championship, they're only ahead of them by 1 point. And I think we can all agree that if they had literally any other driver that was more talented in the second car, that driver would have been able to score 1 more point than Stroll has so far, thus taking even more points away from Mercedes. Aston Martin purposefully choosing to shoot themselves in the foot by having a one-driver team is a whole different video, but the point is, as Fernando Alonso himself pointed out just before he re-signed with Aston Martin, when asked whether Mercedes would be a more attractive option, he said, "Mercedes is behind us, so it doesn't feel that attractive." I think it's also only right to talk about the drivers as well. Now, to be honest, knowing the quality of both of the drivers, with Lewis being the easiest example, having won multiple races and multiple championships across multiple regulation periods, and for different teams as well, which is incredibly rare for champions in F1 history, I find it difficult to pin that much, if any, blame on either driver for Mercedes' downfall. However, I also think it would be disingenuous to say that they have absolutely no responsibility whatsoever. There's no doubt that over the last few seasons, Lewis and George have made some uncharacteristic and unnecessary mistakes, and at times under-delivered, specifically in qualifying, getting knocked out multiple times in Q2 and even Q1. Having said that, the fact that both drivers have struggled for consistency with the car during various weekends, and sometimes with one driver liking the balance with the other one struggling in the same session, it reinforces my belief that it's more down to the inconsistency of the car, especially in qualifying, unless the driver's not being able to maximize its performance or holding the team back compared to their teammate. It's a very different situation to the one that Red Bull was going through a few years ago, where outside of Max Verstappen, who was able to maximize the car and maximize his talent, no one else was able to cope with the early corner rotation of the Red Bull, but then subsequently in other teams were able to win races after leaving Red Bull. I also think initially in 2022, and specifically off the back of losing the title the way that he did in Abu Dhabi 21, which no one can even begin to relate to in terms of what that must have been like, I think it was quite tough for Lewis mentally, because he definitely came into the season swinging, famously saying that his team don't make mistakes, and trying to have that aggressive, motivating mentality to win back the title that he felt was stolen. When the reality hit of just how bad Mercedes were, and that this was not going to be a quick turnaround, I think that it took a little bit longer for Lewis and also Toto compared to George coming from Williams to set those new expectations and adjust mentally that this was their new reality. Having said that, once Lewis embraced where the team were and felt obligated as the team leader to put himself forward to do any experimental work to help them figure out the car, even if it was to the detriment of his pace, I think then his 2023 season, getting that pole position in Hungary, and most importantly, finishing third in the championship, better than anyone else not driving a Red Bull, and that despite being disqualified from second place in Austin, proved to me that he was able to bounce back, and that in a consistent race-winning car, he is still capable of winning a world championship. Had Lewis continued to struggle in 2023 and had he been convincingly beaten by Russell, I think then we could be having a very different conversation right now about where his current level really is. Although had that happened, Ferrari also wouldn't have signed him in the first place, and there wouldn't be people right now questioning whether Ferrari made a mistake or not. The fact is, rightly or wrongly, Toto Wolff decided not to give Lewis a long-term contract because he was more interested in the prospect of Antonelli in the near future, and Ferrari saw that whilst Sainz is a perfectly capable race-winning driver, Lewis, by virtue of single-handedly propelling Mercedes up to second in the constructors, still had that X-factor that Sainz just doesn't have. In terms of George Russell, his time at Mercedes so far has also been pretty mixed. He had a strong start to 22, getting his first win, which in hindsight had a lot of other repercussions that I'll get into, but then 23 was a really bizarre and really bad season on his behalf. Not only did Lewis dominate George with him finishing down in 8th in the championship, but he also made a lot of unforced concentration errors, crashing in Canada, Monaco, and Singapore. There is still a lot of people that believe that on a talent level, that Mercedes have the best driver lineup on the grid. And that is why, with how insanely close the upper midfield has been, unless you are Max Verstappen driving a Red Bull where there isn't that same level of pressure and competition, we have seen all of the upper midfield drivers make mistakes. Hamilton, Russell, Norris, Piastri, Leclerc, Sainz, Alonso, whether it's qualifying or in the race, none of these drivers have been perfect in the ground effect era if you really dissect their seasons. And it's a product of how competitive and close that fight for the podium has been between the four teams. Something else that's been interesting to watch is how Toto Wolff has managed the team and how he's handled their decline. To be honest, I've actually been a little bit critical of some of the things that he has said and done, because too often it feels as though there's a lot of mixed messaging. After some of the races, he has been brutally honest, like after Sao Paulo 23, and openly admitted that even if they could do the weekend all over again, they just don't know what to fundamentally change about the car setup to make it better. However, then there's races like the recent Japanese Grand Prix where Wolff, after the race, claimed that with a different strategy, they could have been on the podium. Russell, who was the highest placed Mercedes, finished 25 seconds away from the podium. That is a monumental amount of race time to make up, and I don't know what kind of car he thinks his drivers had in Japan, but if he thinks that with a different strategy they could have been on the podium, then he's deluded. Given that Toto is not only the team principal but also a 33% owner of the Mercedes F1 team, by definition, just as he was partly responsible for how long Mercedes continued to dominate for after he came in, he also now has to take some responsibility for their sudden decline. Unlike the new breed of team principals, his background isn't rooted in the technical side, and under his watch, not only has the operational side of the team really declined, along with their obvious performance deficit, but major technical Mercedes personnel have also either left or been lost to the likes of Aston Martin, Audi, and especially Red Bull's brand new powertrains division. All of the reasons that I have talked about, however, pale into comparison to the biggest reason why Mercedes have fallen behind, and it's simply because the car that they have produced isn't anywhere near as fast over a lap, over a race distance, or across a range of different tracks as the Red Bull. And now, over the past 2.5 years, I have read and listened to F1 journalists, technical experts, and most importantly, the technical people from within Mercedes, and even now, as of early 2024, I will echo exactly what Martin Brundle said in a recent Sky Sports podcast. The reason not a single person can still give you a definitive answer as to why Mercedes have got this rule cycle so wrong is because Mercedes themselves don't even know. It's true that they have lost a lot of key people that made the previous era so successful, like engineering director Aldo Costa, engine director Andy Cowell, and even technical director James Allison when he previously stepped down during 2021 in favour of Mike Elliott, before being brought back full-time in 2023. Now, whilst those key people could be a factor, correlation doesn't always mean causation, and you've got to imagine that in a team as big as Mercedes, they would have a structure so that if one individual leaves, it doesn't then have an adverse effect on the organization as a whole. Another big reason that I think holds a lot of weight is something that keeps coming back up a lot, and that is their simulation tools. The reason why Mercedes originally landed on the wrong concept whilst developing for 2022 is because they couldn't simulate and therefore predict the porpoising phenomenon in their wind tunnel. Their numbers were telling them that their car was going to have a huge amount of downforce when running in the optimal ride height, but as they found out even after they eliminated the porpoising in 2023, they still don't know how to keep their car in the optimal ride height because their simulations aren't correlating to what's happening on the track. This is also why the team, even to this day, spends so much time altering their setups and why they struggle so much on sprint weekends, where you need to be able to predict and have a good grasp of what your car is going to be like beforehand. Their mechanical platform and the way that it interacts with the floor to keep the car stable and producing consistent downforce across a range of ride heights just isn't at the level of what Red Bull has been able to do. The car has been consistently described to be on a knife edge because it has such a small operating window, and the moment that you're out of it, the car becomes unstable, the drivers lose confidence in it, and it also doesn't work the tyres as efficiently. On the engine side, whilst most of the power units now are fairly close to one another, since the introduction of the E10 fuels in 22, it does feel like the likes of Honda and Ferrari have definitely overtaken Mercedes. And now, there's a very big misnomer that the only reason that Mercedes dominated for as long as they did in the previous era was because their power unit was so much better than everyone else's. Whilst that was true for the early hybrid era, by 2018, Ferrari in particular not only caught up to Mercedes, but had the better power unit based off raw performance for both 2018 and 2019. You can say what you want about the legality and reliability of their power unit, but then by 2020 and especially 2021, it was Honda who stepped up with Red Bull with a power unit that was just as good on power circuits and was also comparable on reliability as well. Before the 2024 season started, technical director James Allison did a fantastic interview talking in depth about the technical struggles that Mercedes have had, and I'll leave a link to it below. He went into detail about Mercedes not having the tools to simulate when bouncing starts to occur, and how keeping their flawed concept off the back of Russell winning the 2022 Sao Paulo Grand Prix was a big mistake, and much, much more. It makes it even more obvious and worrying, however, that despite everything that they've learnt, when you consider that both Ferrari and Mercedes have come out with all new concepts for 2024 that they really should have had in 2023, with major changes made to the W15 with new suspension, a new chassis, new front wing design, new seating position, and a brand new gearbox casing for more aero opportunities, Ferrari's first iteration of their new concept is immediately the second fastest car on the grid, whilst Mercedes are further behind than they've ever been in the hybrid era. Even though they have closed the gap to Red Bull compared to 2022, relative to the field, the other teams have still managed to outdevelop them, and now they find themselves with, at best, the 4th or 5th fastest car on the grid. Despite telling us after every single race that they have learned a lot and are improving all the time, it's clear that even after 3 years, Mercedes still don't have a good enough understanding of this rule set. The team undoubtedly will now be looking at 2026 as a fresh restart. Fundamentally, the cars are still going to be ground effect, and even though the aero rules still haven't been finalized as of recording, so we don't know specifically what the car's going to look like for 26, what we do know is that just like in 2014, the power unit will definitely be a performance differentiator. For 26, the combustion engine and electrical power will now contribute a 50-50 split to the final power output, signifying a major power unit challenge for all of the teams. With Red Bull powertrains building their own power unit in association with Ford for the very first time, with Honda moving over full time with Aston Martin, and with Audi coming in completely fresh, Mercedes and Ferrari will have the biggest stability and winning pedigree heading into the new engine regulations. Mercedes nailed the engine regs once before, albeit with more money and committing to it earlier than anyone else, which is impossible with current restrictions. But they can, once again, be the leaders on the power unit side. And now of course, that's not going to give you long-term success because all of the power units are going to converge eventually, and you've got to have a complete understanding of power unit, aero, mechanical, tires, and for 2026, movable aero as well. But it does feel like because the power unit is the single biggest change, it also represents the single biggest opportunity for one of the teams to get an early advantage over the rest. Whether that team will be Mercedes, whether they'll figure out why their simulations have led them down such a wrong path that they still haven't managed to find their way out of, only time will tell. But 2026 really will give us a definitive answer on whether Mercedes' title challenging days in its current form really are over in the same way that it ended for Williams and most recently McLaren, or if they can reinvent themselves to become title challengers once again in the same way that Red Bull did in the post-Vettel era. Well, there you have it. This was certainly a very big video to put together, so if you did enjoy it and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated. And once again, a big thank you to Surfshark. Don't forget to use code ALDAS or check out the link at the very top of the description. So once again, a big thank you to Surfshark, and I'll see you in the next one.